Good afternoon to those on the East Coast. My name is Tim Phillips, and I'm the founder and CEO of Beyond Conflict. And I'll do a bit more of an introduction in a few minutes, but I wanted to mention a few housekeeping steps for this seminar, which is part of a series led by the Lannan Center at Georgetown, which Amanada will talk about, and then Mark Muller. We will ask people to put questions in the chat box. As the moderator, will be looking at those and trying to pull those together for our speakers. And very much look forward to active engagement and conversation after the presentations. And this is being recorded, and a copy of this will be made available later. And before I introduce the next two speakers, I want to thank both Jill Lewis and Jasmine Ramsey, my colleagues, for helping pull this together with support from Patty Guzman at the Lannan Center and Emily at Beyond Borders. So with that, I'm going to turn to my colleague and friend Amanada Forner, who directs the Lannan Center at Georgetown, to say a few words, and then we'll go to Mark Muller, who leads Beyond Borders in Scotland and is the other partner in this symposium. So thank you, and over to you, Amanada.
Thanks so much, Tim, and thank you to Myriam Cottias, Jadé Botha, Ebrahim Rasool, and everyone at Beyond Conflict who's helped put together this event, which is the last in our seminar series before the 2022 Lannan Symposium, which will be held at Georgetown University. The idea for this seminar series and for the symposium came together pretty much on the day of January the 7th last year, after the storming of the US Capitol, in a three-way conversation between Mark Muller, Tim Phillips, and myself about America's trajectory in the recent past and into the future. And to that end, we've held two seminars. The first was entitled "The View from Abroad, What Can America Learn from the Experience of Other Nations at a Time of Crisis," and saw writers from Turkey, Bosnia, meeting with peace negotiators, including Ebrahim Rasool, but also Monica McWilliams of Northern Ireland. And then in August at the Beyond Borders Festival, we discussed the question, is there such a thing as American exceptionalism? And let me just say a few quick words about the symposium, which takes the themes of our series on a pace. Our dates are the 22nd to 23rd of March, and we open with a keynote speech from Melody Barnes, Executive Director of the University of Virginia's Karsh Institute of Democracy. On the 23rd, we have a day of talks and discussions between writers, historians, journalists, policymakers, and social scientists. Some names include Clint Smith, whose New York Times bestseller, How the Word Is Passed, speaks to this discussion, the one we're about to hear. The day will also feature writers including Rabih Alameddine from Lebanon, Alexander Hemon, Bosnian American, Patricia Smith, American poet, and journalist and author of Janesville, Amy Goldstein, talking about, among other things, America's narrative battles, writing in a time of crisis, debating whether America needs a TRC, and contemplating what a future narrative for the United States might sound like. So you can read more about the symposium, which will be live and live streamed at lannan.georgetown.edu. And I hope very much we'll see some of you there. Thanks a lot, Tim.
Thank you, Amanada, and over to Mark. I can't hear you, Mark. There you go.
Hi, Tim. Well, first of all, let me just congratulate you and Beyond Conflict for organizing this important webinar, and particularly the focus of the webinar, which I think is critical to everything that we are trying to do in this initiative. As Amanada made clear, this webinar falls part of a larger initiative that was launched by the Lannan Center, exploring and reimagining American identity. And we at Beyond Borders, in our International Festival of Literature and Thought, held that talk on American exceptionalism, exploring America's historical legacy in the making of the modern world in association with the New York Times. And for those that are interested, the talk can be viewed on the Beyond Border Scotland YouTube channel, which a link of which will be put up hopefully during the course of this talk. For those of you that don't know Beyond Borders, it's a Scottish-based organization dedicated to helping nations and groups overcome conflict and misunderstanding through international dialogue and cultural exchange. It was founded 10 years ago after a group of us involved in international mediation increasingly came to understand the critical role that cultural dialogue can play in helping people to understand and resolve conflict. We provide safe spaces for groups affected by conflict to talk to each other and share experiences with those who have faced and overcome similar problems. So with that, let me just perhaps share 4 observations that I can perhaps bring to this discussion. Firstly, I think the point should be made that the US is not alone in facing conflicts over its history, identity, and form of political union. Here in the UK, we are also exploring contested histories. For example, over the nature of our union and the impact of the British Empire. Civic monuments that have stood for years are now being pulled down for their association with slavery. So the US is not alone in confronting its past and also in contemplating its future. Secondly, as a UN peace mediator, I've come to learn that while most people involved in conflict see their own conflict as unique, there are certain underlying similarities that often underpin many of them. For example, if you scratch below the surface, you will find that most, if not all, conflict involves some form of exclusion in which one or more sides do not feel included or listened to. We have found that the issue of trust and safe spaces in which to talk and listen to each other is paramount, and that is why this webinar is so important. Thirdly, we have also learned that other countries and their experiences are often relevant to those experiencing conflict in home. For example, in Scotland, we went through a very heated but peaceful debate over the future of the union with England during our referendum process. And I would say that trust in the process was critical to both sides accepting the final outcome. And I think there are important lessons that the US can learn from Scotland and other countries that have experienced similar contested histories, but also arguments about their political union. And finally, and I said it at the start of this initiative, I just want to refer to Rabbi Burns's insight when he said, "Oh, would some power the gift give us to see others, ourselves as others see us, it would from many a blunder free us." So the Lannan Center initiative helps America to do this. We have an interest in how America sees itself because America has a profound effect on all our lives. And I think the lens of looking at some of your contested histories and your discussions about the future of America can be helped by also considering how others see you. So thank you, Georgetown, for initiating this important initiative. And thank you, Tim, for carrying it forward with this particular debate over contested histories. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Aminata, as well, both for your comments and for the leadership on this initiative. So I just want to spend a few minutes just to sort of frame this conversation in a bit more detail and then introduce our first speaker. As I mentioned, I'm Tim Phillips. I'm the founder of CEO of Beyond Conflict. And as an organization, if you don't know us, we're now in our 30th anniversary as a nonprofit, having worked mostly around the world in 75 countries, helping leaders across divides at different levels imagine what change could look like, either in the transition from communism to dictatorship in Eastern Europe, or from apartheid to democracy in South Africa, or from conflict to peace in many other countries around the world. And the model we developed is the one of shared experience, meaning that we would sort of, as Americans, set the table and bring in people like Ebrahim or Myriam or others across divides to share their experience with people who couldn't imagine that they could be agents of change in a very difficult environment or that they could reach across divides to find allies and partners to make change possible. And in the last 10 years, we started engaging with brain and behavioral scientists to bring those insights in, because we realized that there are many intractable conflicts and many fragile peace agreements in the world. And we need to understand something deeper and more nuanced about what it is to be human, actually how we think, how human cognition and emotion actually plays a role in shaping how we engage in the world. And then thanks to the last administration, we started focusing a fair amount of our work here in the United States. And in many ways, the previous 25 years of work around the world was to prepare us to bring it home to the United States and to bring home these lessons from people in Europe and South Africa and Northern Ireland, the Middle East and Central America, and many other countries who struggled through these issues of identity, of narrative, of contested histories. And so we as Americans very humbly have to learn from abroad at this moment. And this is why when Amanata and Mark suggested this series about learning from abroad, it really resonated with me and with my colleagues at this particular moment. So what we're focusing on in this discussion is very specifically around the issues of contested histories, particularly around issues of monuments, memorials, statues, place names. And it's a very contested set of issues and debates here in the United States. On one hand, it's the teaching of our history through critical race theory that's being contested in many states and schools, or it's what do we do with statues? The more obvious statues that are being contested have to do with Confederate leaders and generals from the Civil War, but it's also Christopher Columbus. It's also Mount Rushmore on a large scale, or that literally thousands of place names and toponymic names that the Department of Interior has to think through and navigate and rescript over the next 4 years. In some ways, the United States is going to be facing the biggest rescription of its toponymic, place name, never mind the really well-known memorials, since the American Revolution. And coming up in 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And I make that distinction rather than saying the founding of the nation, because to Native American friends and colleagues, this has been a land of many nations over many thousands of years. And so how stories are told, not only in textbooks and in articles, but in stone and in building and place names, can both memorialize, but also can stigmatize, can also contract, but also expand a sense of who we are as a people. And so we're at this moment as a country where the United States is facing demands, necessary demands to reckon with our history, while people are calling for us to reconcile our people. But if I've learned one lesson over the last 30 years working abroad, is that one has to reconcile their history to really reconcile their people. And I think that's the moment we're at as Americans right now. And there's a famous painting by Gauguin here in Boston, where I am, at the Museum of Fine Arts. It's a triptych that he did of these Tahitian women. And in French, he wrote in the upper left-hand corner, who are we? Where are we from? And where are we going? And I think that's one of the central questions we have as Americans at this point, and particularly at this moment of these contested histories. And so I want to add 2 or 3 more key points. We have this 250th anniversary coming up, and it's a moment of both reckoning, but also renewal. And how we as Americans look to that point and to be honest and think about how do we tell the collective story? How do we really build a more inclusive, not only democracy, but a more inclusive history that may have been very exclusionary in the way it's been manifested and told? And the other thing which we'll learn from Jadé, Myriam, and Ebrahim, we are not new, as I've said, to these challenges. And over the last many years in Europe and elsewhere in South Africa, people have been struggling through this. And one thing that's clear is process is needed. Because from a very practical point of view, which we'll learn from Jadé in her presentation, is that many of the decisions to put up a monument or name a building or a place happens locally through historic commissions, through city government, through city councils. And that's where the decision to take down will also take place. So how do we give tools and resources and lessons learned as well to communities here in the United States, as well as abroad? And the last thing I'll say before I turn it to our first speaker, Myriam, is there's a lot we can learn also from the emerging fields of brain and behavioral science of how we can not only construct our identities, but how we really need to feel like we're understood, not just as individuals in the moment, but as communities in the histories that are ascribed and seen around them, in statues and place names. And, you know, sacred values are not just religious values, but those values that we hold dear to us as individuals and communities and shape our group bonds and identity. What's amazing from the research in brain and behavioral science, we process those things that are sacred to us in a different region of the brain than utilitarian considerations. And when we feel that our sacred values are under threat or people seeking to compromise them, we respond with aggression and we hold on to them more deeply. So this minefield of how we navigate what is sacred and what is important and what is necessary is really key at this moment. I should say that we're now in Black History Month in the United States. And I want to pay respect to that month because so much of what we're navigating has to do with the history of the African-American experience in the United States and the many immigrants on top of the Native and Indigenous communities that were here for literally thousands of years before. So I would say, yes, we absolutely have to reckon with our history in every dimension, but we also have to think about how, with that process, do we renew a democracy for the 21st century. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I'm going to turn to Myriam Cottias. And just briefly, Myriam is the director at the International Center for Research on Slavery and Post-Slavery in Paris, president of the International Scientific Committee of UNESCO, and from 2013 to 2016, served as president of the National Committee for the History and Memory of Slavery, and is a very distinguished scholar and practitioner and historian, and I'm honored and privileged to have her join us. So Myriam, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and for your introduction and also the question you address, because they are very important question. And I will say that they are not only Americans, but they are really global questions. And I will speak, I will try to share my screen. Is it okay? Could you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet? Oh.
There we go.
Here we go. And okay. And I do it again as, no, it's not this.
Now we see the first image. It says crime.
Yes, yes. Okay. I'm sorry, I have to do this again. Oops.
Go right ahead, but I have to say I'm the least equipped person to navigate this.
I'm sorry.
There's the first slide is up now, Myriam.
Oh, okay. And you only see the first slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I will talk about more specifically the history of slavery in France and how it is included in a public space in France, and also what are the contested histories around slavery. And first thing I have to say that when we are talking about France, we have to consider continental France, but also overseas communities, meaning the old colonies of France in the Caribbean island or the Indian Ocean. That's important to say because because it's a kind of a narrative which is a little bit exceptional, even though as exceptional is not the word really. But let's talk about, so slavery was a big event in the French histories in the 17th century. And it creates these colonies in the Antilles, French Antilles, Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyane, and La Réunion. A specificity of this history in France was that it was very silent. That when people talk about the history of France, they don't talk about the history of slavery, and they don't talk about the colonial history. It seems that it's another sequence of the history of France. And that was a problem, actually, because slavery creates wealth in France, and also in 1848, in the abolition of slavery in France, the former enslaved people became French. They became citizens in equality in the text with the other French citizens. So, but this history was silenced. And in 1988, there was this big demonstration in France, but also in the overseas department, saying slavery is a crime against humanity. This big mobilization and of people in France led to a law which is quite unique, because I think it's the only one in the world with Senegal, with a law called the Taubira Law in May 10th, 2001, who declaring that slavery and the slavery in the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean were crime against humanity, and that the French state recognized this. It was quite an important moment, but this moment was also silenced because the law passed and nobody talked really about the law. But this law created a national committee to improve the knowledge on the slavery in France. It created a national commemorative day, the 10 May. Each 10 May, there is a celebration for the memory of the enslaved people. It creates this committee. It creates in the law, there is also an improvement. There is a improvement of teaching in the of the history of slavery. There is also a national prize for the school who worked especially on the history of slavery. So you have a lot of policy decision on this question in France. As you might see here on the screen, there is also a memorial in the Jardin du Luxembourg with a monument, and with also a plaque who say that because of the struggle of the enslaved people and the desire of dignity and liberty, the enslaved people in the French colony participate completely in the universality of the human rights and at the ideal of freedom, equality, and fraternity with the basis of the French Republic. Some other monuments were also created in Paris. This one is a Place du Général Catroux, which is a symbol, you know, of breaking the chain, and it's also a connection of the importance of the writer Alexandre Dumas, which is very famous in France, but nobody knew until 10 years ago that he was coming from Saint-Domingue. His family was coming from Saint-Domingue. So there is this kind of a framework of recognition. Memory is in dialogue with association of African descents in the city, because it's true that there are two levels. There is a level of the state and there is a level of cities. So, for example, in Nantes, you have now a memorial on the abolition of slavery. You have also a discussion about the name the street were named after slave trader, and there was this big debate of what to do with this name. There is also in Bordeaux a memorial of Toussaint Louverture, with also a question on the street who had the name of a slave trader. Another monument in Bordeaux. You have Toussaint Louverture, and also a monument of this woman, a former enslaved woman called Modeste Testa, and who is a monument to recognize not the heroes of the history of slavery, but even though the enslaved people who were forgotten by the history. You have also in La Rochelle the statue de Toussaint Louverture. So that's for some city in continental France. But you have also the overseas collectivity, as I said, with a woman called Solitude in Guadeloupe, who participate into a slave uprising in 1802, when Napoleon wanted to reinstall the slavery. You have also a big museum called the Memorial Act, who was erected in 2015, which is the first museum on slavery in France, and also another monument in Martinique, which is Cap 110, with a monument for the enslaved, the person who came with the last slave boat in Martinique. So, and it's only some monuments, some monuments who are in the public space in France, in continental France, in overseas. So you could say that with a law, with public policies very, very strong, the question will be over. But it's not the case at all. And I will turn to the statue Josephine de Bourne, because first thing I have to say that even though these big policies were put on the table in France, and with these monuments recognize part of the history of slavery, the question of reparation for slavery stayed on the table, meaning that each year and each commemoration day on the 10th of May, the question of reparation for slavery was asked with association of Afro-descents. So the question is why? You know, because you could consider that some things were done and it was not enough. And the question is really why? And I put it in a very, very naive way to introduce my words. If you take the statue of Josephine de Bourne in Martinique, for example, until 2020, you could see this monument, meaning it's a monument of a woman without head and with red paint on her body. Because Josephine de Bourne was the wife of Napoleon, and in 1970, some independentist activists cut their head and put this blood on her body, really to symbolize her involvement, which is not completely true, but symbolically, yes, involvement in the slave trade and in slavery. And as a matter of fact, Aimé Césaire chose to leave the statue like this with that head, because it was a way to think about the two ways to tell the story and to tell the history of slavery, the history of slave owners, and the activism and the reaction and the way to see the history differently for the activist persons. In 2020, what happened is that statue was destroyed, you could see here, and it was destroyed at the same time as the statue of Christophe Colomb was destroyed in Martinique, and also the stanue of Victor Schellcher, who was the abolitionist who plead for the abolition of slavery in France, meaning that all these symbols of the history of slavery were destroyed, and with persons who say that, you know, we have enough with the history of slavery, and we have it's enough to have this injustice. It's enough to have this racism in our societies, and it's enough to have this asymmetry of powers in our society. At the same time, in Paris, there was this statue of Colbert, and Colbert was the father of the Code Noir, the Black Code, who transformed the enslaved people in object, who dehumanized the enslaved persons. And it's a reason why some Afro-descent associations put this red painting on him to symbolize the crime and to symbolize the violence. So reparation is on the top. Reparation is the question, and I think that I could put also this, which is also a way to ask for honor, respect, and justice. It's on the table, and we need to talk about what is the history of slavery, what is the memory, and also what are the heritage of the history of slavery in France. And as a matter of fact, we need a new narrative. We need a new narrative in public space. We need to take into account the history of slavery, and we need to rebalance in the public space the symbols who are in the street, in the towns. And for example, one proposal I've made. It's to put, because this statue is just in the front of the French Assembly in France. And I propose to put a statue of Toussaint Louverture, just, you know, I don't know, à côté, aside, yes, aside this statue, because the question is really to rebalance the symbols in the public space. It's also, and we need also to do a co-construction of symbols, and that's, I think it's an important issue. I mean, we need to engage a dialogue and a general dialogue among different citizens in France and in our country, and I think it's more than in France. We need to co-construct symbols on contested history, and because it's really a political question, and I think it's not possible to have equality. It's not possible to have even so democracy if we don't take into account, you know, all segments, all elements of our history. And I think it's a major issue. It's a major issue because there is a transnational circulation of information, and this circulation of information, which is also circulation of claims, it is important to link these claims with a real knowledge of history, because I show you, you know, this.
Myriam,
yes.
I'm afraid we're going to have to go to Ebrahim.
Okay. Okay. But I really finish, because it's the main words are co-construction, equality, and equality for democracy. And the knowledge of history is really a political question. And I will finish this.
No. Thank you. We'll come back in the conversation, and you raised some really key points about co-construction, needing a new narrative, and the rebalancing. I mean, all of those are really key, and all of those are really good, both insights and almost suggestions for what here in the United States we really need to be thinking about. And I'm going to turn to our friend and colleague, Ebrahim Rasool, who can speak to this, particularly having lived a time of revolution and liberation and struggle, and actually helped defining it by an activist, somebody who served time in prison, somebody who then was part of a negotiated transition that was moving away from not only apartheid, but all the symbols that surrounded you, Ebrahim, in apartheid South Africa, into a democracy, a multiracial democracy. And now, nearly 30 years later, I'm sure there's a lot that you can reflect on. And I'll just briefly say, for those who don't know Ebrahim Rasool, I mentioned earlier, he was an ANC activist at a young age, served time in prison. He then joined the negotiations and became governor of the Western Cape, which is the area around Cape Town, served in the local and national governments under the ANC, and was the South African ambassador to the United States. All of those aside, he's one of the most thoughtful people I've met in 30 years of doing work around the world. And I knew when we had this conversation, I'd want Ebrahim to be part of this. So Ebrahim, it's over to you. And I'll be a little bit more strict with you than I was with Myriam on the time. And then we'll get into a conversation.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thanks very much, my fellow panelists, and thanks very much to all those who have joined this very crucial discussion, because while it is billed as something that the United States must learn from, I think it is something that we're all grappling with, our sense of history and the sense of imagination that we carry into the world. Today in South Africa and all over the world, it is the 2nd of February. In South Africa, this is poignant, not only for those who love numbers, 2222. And the Archbishop would be hearing that, but it's the 2nd of February, and 32 years ago, F.W. de Klerk made the declaration in the then apartheid parliament as the last apartheid president that he was unbanning the liberation movements, freeing Nelson Mandela and the political prisoners, and creating the conditions for a transition from apartheid to democracy. And so today in South Africa is a very, very critical day, because that declaration was also setting out a fundamental conundrum, a puzzle that asks some questions. Did the liberation movements defeat apartheid? I think there were heroic struggles, major sacrifices, but apartheid had a strong army and had a few good decades possibly left in it. So it wasn't particularly a defeat of apartheid. Therefore, the flip side of that question was apartheid's dominance sustainable? And clearly not. It was isolated. The West had had no longer any need for it, and the liberation movements were gaining ascendancy. So it was not a matter that they could go on governing forever. And therefore, there was rather a mutual recognition that the two opposing forces, the force of apartheid and the forces of liberation, could not obliterate each other away, could not wish each other away, and needed to find a formula for coexistence. The status quo was unsustainable, but in the attempts to destroy each other, we were only guaranteeing the mutually assured destruction. And therefore, how would this mode of coexistence really look, and how would we get through it? And the immediate next few years after this, there were three critical mechanisms. There was an election which expressed the popular will. The liberation movements became the governments. Secondly, there was a constitution. And very importantly, this constitution fundamentally gave South Africans their human dignity, essentially gave them human rights. There was still abiding racism, still abiding discrimination, but essentially human rights were assured and justiciable, and progressively the human needs were going to be met. And so there was a recognition of the persistence of the past, a persistence of color-coded inequality, and a persistence of poverty. And the third mechanism that I think came about was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not simply reconciliation, but the disclosure of truth in order to be reconciled. And that opened up a sense of justice as being threefold. It wasn't absolute justice. That's the Nuremberg type. You hunt down everybody who was a perpetrator and you prosecute them and you punish them. It was transitional justice because it needed enough justice to take us through a long transition. And it was restorative justice. We could not get immediate reparations. We could not get everything we wanted, but we needed progressively to restore to people what was necessary. And therefore, the TRC made memory, the memory of evil, palpable by disclosing the horror, but brought some closure and some accountability as we went on. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. The second thing that I think is important to say is to repeat what Agathon, the Greek dramatist, said many years ago: not even God can change the past. It's how we manage the past, how we bring the past into conversation, because the past is always present. And so the South African transition particularly, and I'm sure that in the USA and everywhere else, has particularly got to deal with three scenarios of the past. It is not the scenario where evil was defeated and supplanted. And if you work on the scenario that it was defeated, you go down the road of the Arab Spring and particularly Egypt. Nor was it a scenario that evil would simply persist and render itself normal. In South Africa, it wasn't, but maybe in the United States, the wrongs of the past have rendered themselves normal. And I think that that is a very important point of debate that we must proceed with. But it was a scenario where good and evil was unable to gain the ascendancy over each other, and therefore it needed to prepare for an uncomfortable coexistence. And so this uncomfortable coexistence was pierced in South Africa in 2015 when a protest movement called Rhodes Must Fall perceived that the lack of transformation was symbolized by the persistence of the symbols of colonialism, of apartheid, of imperialism. And Rhodes, Cecil John Rhodes, was the most pervasive one in Cape Town, and that was the object of attack. The irony does not escape us that in the 1950s, after the apartheid government of the National Party was established in 1948, Afrikaner students also wanted to start their version of a Rhodes Must Fall because he was the symbol of English imperialism or British imperialism. And now it was Black students particularly and lecturers and so forth at the University of Cape Town that understood the institutional racism symbolized by Rhodes. It was also a critique of whether the ANC had prioritized the memory, the reconstruction and the healing of memory. And it was particularly someone like Albie Sachs who understood something that Myriam was ending up with, that maybe we should not go for the kind of destruction of those kind of symbols. But that Rhodes Must Fall campaign really brought that uncomfortable coexistence between the two histories, the two pasts that were competing onto the scene. In the last few minutes, I want to say that as the United States looks at the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, we must say that independence often means what you break away from, not a breakthrough to unities, to new identities, to new imaginations of how people could live together and work together. And so, in a sense, the contradictions of the United States are made visible, as in South Africa, in the public space, both through what memory is celebrated, and it's a memory of supremacism that is celebrated, and what laws emanate from that that are prioritized, and therefore the idea of the plaintive refrain of Black Lives Matter says that if you even have to speak that Black Lives Matter, what is being prioritized in the public and the institutional sphere. And so the question is not whether it is right or wrong. The question is, what do we do with it? And in South Africa, there's an African saying that says, your anger is hot, but it cannot cook. Meaning that your anger must be given direction, it must be given strategy, it must be given the potency to make something different happen. Otherwise, it may just consume you. And therefore, the need for thoughtful, nuanced, and strategic interventions with these conundrums that we have is absolutely crucial. Being right is not enough. It is only the starting point. And being in power, as the ANC and South Africa has discovered, is also not enough, because you are dealing with competing priorities. The first one is to prevent counter-revolution, just to secure the beachhead that you have won. The second one is to maintain economic viability. Don't let the whole world and its institutions turn on you and bankrupt you before you're out of the starting blocks. And the third one is to provide enough of a foothold for the poor and the historically marginalized to eke out a living. And that may have been where the initial governments of Mandela and Mbeki and so forth tried to prioritize those needs, but maybe they've done it at the expense of understanding that memory is critical to identity. I must say that my time in the United States and coming from a so-called colored community, a small national minority in the Western Cape, I have seen similarities between that Cape Town minority community called the Cape Coloreds and the African American community in the United States. Both communities were victims of enslavement. A genocide had taken place. Death of a language had taken place. And they all showed the same pathologies. Their incarceration levels were disproportionate to the population size. The addiction levels to alcohol and drugs was disproportionate. The violence levels, particularly gender-based violence, was disproportionate to other larger communities in South Africa. And that must begin to say, what's the connection between your memory being cut off with genocide, your memory being interfered with in slavery, and your dislocation from your cultural anchors in life, and so forth. And so in South Africa, we need to understand, as you must understand in the United States, that the erasure or the erosion of memory has material costs. And therefore the scripture says to us that people shall not live by bread alone. We need to understand the role of memorialization in either making public spaces inclusive or exclusive. And so for me, what do we do with all those memorials, with all those names, with all those museums that celebrate only supremacy and emphasize marginalization and defeat for those on the wrong side of it? The first response to that challenge is perpetuation, business as usual. Don't change the memorials. That's the history, and the powerful will keep it in place, and the neglectful will not do anything about it. And so the perpetuation model is not sustainable. Secondly, the option is iconoclasm. Destroy the idols, destroy the artifacts of supremacy. And you can destroy it either by desecration, and we've seen, for example, in one of the Rhodes statues, also the head and the red paint being used here. The other one is destruction, to get rid of it, and we've seen some of that begin to happen. But at the end of the day, is that sustainable? It may give us immediate satisfaction, but it does not necessarily restore our own memory of ourselves. And the last one is then what I think Myriam was beginning to speak to, and which I want to emphasize, is possibly the idea of juxtaposition, of conversation and confrontation of the existing supremacist by bringing it into a dialogue, possibly a dialectic with its opposite. And so the slave master juxtaposed with the slave or the enslaved, the exterminator, the one who drove genocide, juxtaposed and brought into confrontation and conversation with the exterminated. The perpetrator brought into juxtaposition with the victim. And how do we then use this to give the latter, the enslaved, the exterminated, the victim, agency and voice? Because again, another African saying says, until the lions have their own historians, history will only glorify the hunter. And so we need to understand, how do we do that? We can go and we can seek the formal permissions and say, please, could we put up a memorial to the genocide of the indigenous Americans, or the enslaved as they were brought here and shackled, where the slave owners and the frontier warriors went. Or we could do it a lot more by stealth, informality. The way in which we represent our memory may not always be in the formal ways, but I think we've got to ensure that a strategy of juxtaposition, and I think increasingly we're beginning to move in that direction, because unless we do that, the anger will boil up and it will lead to the iconoclasm from those who feel marginalized, or it will lead to populism and other manifestations of the re-supremacization of society, as the United States may want to go. I think the sustainable way out may be a strategy of juxtaposition. Thank you very much.
Ebrahim, thank you. I'm glad this is recorded for what you and Myriam have said so far. And I will come back to some of the points you just raised and Myriam raised after we hear from Jadé, one of your former constituents. And then some questions have been coming in from the attendees, and I'll get to those after the next presentation. But I took a lot of notes, as I'm sure a lot of people have from your presentation, and your point about not even God can change the past is a several thousand-year-old quote, and it's a really interesting starting point to how we navigate all these issues. So with that, I want to turn to Jadé Botha, who is with Euroclio and also works with the International Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation based in Europe, founded by a good friend, Tim Ryback and Marie-Louise Ryback as well, and for many years have been looking at issues of contested history and started working with Jadé and Myriam and others over the last several years, really trying to explore these issues in Europe, and then also take all these insights, take all this information, and actually create tools and resources for activist groups, communities, and for local and national governments to have a process and to think about how do you address these really powerful and important dynamics. And with that, I'll turn to Jadé and we'll go from there.
1 second, let me just get my screen sharing. Perfect, you can see it, right? Okay. Well, actually, this is really going, our project sort of picks up from exactly what Ebrahim was just describing. More often these days, decision makers, people in municipalities, historic committees, universities, are dealing with this question of whether complete iconoclasm or maintenance of the status quo. So what we've just, yes?
Actually, you can't see your screen.
You can't see my screen? Oh, that is because I didn't press screen share. So
No worries.
let me, sorry, 1 second. Now my PowerPoint has frozen.
Now we see it.
Now you see it. Okay, that's good. Sorry about that. It's always fun doing these online events. So as I was saying, the decision makers are now dealing more and more with these contestations, and they have the question of whether to remove it or remain the question and remain the status quo. So as we've seen, there is a big need for decision makers to know actually how to respond to these. And this is where the Contested Histories project was launched in association with the International Bar Association in London, because there's obviously a lot of legal contestations when it comes to these, considering a lot of them are older and protected by historic heritage acts and so on, as well as the Salzburg Global Seminar in Austria. But actually the true cause was through a conversation at Oxford during the time of Rhodes Must Fall with the former High Commissioner for National Minorities of the OSCE. And at the time he expressed that local authorities need access to have reliable information about how to deal with these disputes over statues, street names, memorials, and other physical manifestations of historical legacies, and more often than not, power in public spaces. We quickly realized, looking around, that this was a global phenomenon. It's not unique to one country, and it has happened in different waves in different periods. We saw in the decolonial period in Africa, a great wave of monuments falling, and just recently in 2020 during Black Lives Matter, all of these images came about. And these are all responding to similar legacies. They are related to colonialism, slavery, fascism, totalitarianism, and other egregious acts of mass violence or human rights abuses. So this, of course, raises the question that Ebrahim brought up in his presentation, is how do you actually respond to this? Should it just stay or should it go completely? We started to look globally, and we saw that what happens more often than not are the reactions and decisions regarding these controversies, whether it's a municipal or national level, were often made in haste, in panic, and just wanting to curb a sort of quell of violence. And this actually in some ways exasperated tensions, and this can also deepen social and political divisions in communities. So we hope to, with this project, identify the best practices for contextualizing complex legacies and engaging with difficult histories in a constructive and, most importantly, inclusive manner. So how do we do this? It is a very big undertaking, and this is how we do it. So this is a screenshot of our cases list. So at the moment, as you can see, we have 400 in 110 different countries. So all of these, as you can see, hyperlinked are the cases that are written by postgraduate students. We find these through recommendations from people. We're always getting more. So if you do know of any in your home country, we'd love to hear about them. And also through a Google Alert system that we run in 10 different languages in order to have, when consultations arise, that we find out about them. So what we have done is we needed to make a way that this information would be accessible, but also depoliticized, because often these heat of the moment decisions, of course, come with a lot of political baggage, especially for decision makers. So we needed a way and a platform that was accessible to use and also anonymous. So we have created a relational database based on empirical evidence. So how do we do this? For each case, we fill in a mapping rubric that you can see displayed here. So we look at the type of marker, whether it's a street name or monument. We look at the legacy that it relates to, why it has come under contestation. And we also check the intensity of the contestation from a scale of 1 to 5, as well as the date of the initial construction, the regime, and also the initial actor, whether a contestation over it arose from a protest or an institutional decision. So we put all of this together into a very extensive database that you can see here a snippet of, where you can see that all of these things are mapped. It's all for all 400 cases, so it really is quite a big undertaking. So this is sort of the back end of it, and you can see where we have the incompletes. That's because every single case study that is published goes through a peer reviewer. Actually, Myriam Cottias herself has reviewed some. We give the case to an academic that is familiar with the controversy or either the historical legacy. And in the case study that we develop for each case, we look at the background. So this is sort of the legacy, the principal historical legacy that this case relates to. Then we look at the history of the contestation. And in that section, we don't make any judgments. You can think of it as sort of like an autopsy of a contested monument. We look, how did it first start? What ignited it? What steps were taken and what was the response to this? And then most importantly, we look at the decision-making process. We look at how the decisions that were made by the relevant actor either helped to calm down anger or exacerbate it. And from that, you can extrapolate sort of best practices. So this seems like a lot of information and data, but so it needs to be in a way that's accessible. So we have been working on putting this into a global map. So this is not launched yet. We're still working in the final ends of all of that data cleaning that you just saw. And with this, you can see globally every single case that we have mapped, as well as a summary and a case study of that case. So you can probably notice that there's different colors. I zoom in for Europe just because this is the one that we finished the most data cleaning for. All of it represents a different legacy. And all of the previous boxes that I showed you about date of inauguration, who it represented, whether it was a street, a marker, whether it was activism, a level of contestation, all of this can be filtered in when you search the map so that decision makers are able to actually go in and find what is most relevant to their specific situation. Because the one thing that we've learned from all of this work is that everything is very context specific. It's not a general one size fits all solution. And the primary goal that we had for this map is for it to be a learning platform for users to get a sense of the globality of the issue and learn about how others in their same situations have dealt with these issues. We ideally see this being used by advisors to municipal and state governments, but also to researchers and educators that are interested in these issues, because we also strongly believe that it's very important to make it as accessible as possible. So it's not sort of some ivory tower people talking about statues, but we actually recognize the relevance that this has, considering that we all as citizens, regardless of gender, age, race, inhabit the same public space, but how we are represented in that space is not equal. So now that when we look at the sort of remedies that are gone, what we've seen through this global mapping study is you can sort of see this sliding scale between the two extremes. And these interventions can sort of be divided into two distinct groups, whether aside from removal and status quo. And this is either additive measures to provide a remedy in situ or relocation. So status quo is quite self-evident, so I don't think I need to explain it. That's basically just keeping it there and hoping that people, if they are protesting, eventually get bored and move to something else. It's not the most effective remedy, but it is also, as Ebrahim was talking about, the most popular, I think, among some decision makers, given that it doesn't really do anything to address the historical injustice that is at the root of this representation. For contextualization, this can take many different forms. The most simple is placarding. It's also the least intrusive. You can use a text on a placard to balance sort of the narrative, provide context, or even clarify problematic iconography, or to present newly discovered historical facts. Re-signification, and this is most commonly taken through the form of renaming. So examples of this in the US are Calhoun College at Yale University and B.K. Roberts Hall at Florida State University. But repurposing is perhaps one of the more interesting ones. And this involves a transformation of the object or the site for an alternative purpose. This also involves counter monuments. So a good example of this is in South Africa. There was Ebrahim is probably familiar with it, the Battle of Blood River, which was a battle between Afrikaner voortrekkers and Zulus. And for many years, especially under apartheid, it became a very big symbol of iconography, the vow that was made there. And there was a big sort of voortrekker monument of a lauga that was constructed there, as well as the reconstruction of the wagon. So when we came post-1994, the question was, how do we confront this display of power? And what they did is on the opposite side of the river, because this was situated on a river, they built a counter museum that showed the Zulu perspective on the battle. And between the two sides, they built a bridge called Reconciliation Bridge that was meant to symbolically reconcile the two sides. But also in the previous image I showed you in Paraguay, a statue of the former dictator was repurposed into a work of art by crushing it and putting it between those two massive concrete blocks, but remaining with his face still intact. So repurposing alters the original use, while re-signification is changing the symbolism of it. Both remedies are closely related and they're often interlinked. Maybe a more fun example is a Lenin statue in Ukraine was re-signified through placing a Darth Vader mask on it from Star Wars to cover his face. But also the creation of new statues entirely, or monuments or installations, can also be an especially effective way to recontextualize a confronted object or confront the wall of public silence. For example, in Australia and Botany Bay, in the run-up to the 250th anniversary, I believe, of Captain Cook's landing, they consulted Aboriginal artists to design counter monuments that were placed at the landing site. And then, of course, you also have relocation. So the picture that you see here is of actually Grutas Park in Lithuania. So what happened in the decommunization era, in the fall of the USSR, is that all of sort of the monuments to Stalin, Lenin, and so on were gathered all together and placed into a big statue park. This was also similarly done in Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek statues. And of course, on the other side is removal. This can often be temporary, and when that's done, it's useful, especially when the object has artistic or historical values. And it's normally undertaken for two reasons. The first is to protect the contested object from damage or to avoid further provocation. This was quite commonly done in 2020, such as in Chicago with two statues of Columbus, and also allow time for reflection and also to sort of elongate a bit the decision-making process of how to ultimately deal with it. And the other is permanent removal, completely hiding it from public space. And our sort of main takeaway from this, to wrap it up, is that public space at most part is valuable space, and by definition, it's shared. In an ideal world, of course, this allocation of space and the names and representations that adorn it would project a sense of inclusiveness through historical legacies and reflect a diversity and multi-perspectivity of those who share it. It is incumbent on officials that are responsible for public space to help shape a commemorative landscape and is both representative and inclusive. And as you come into a new era, it is important that how we think about the monumental landscape is reshaped. And I think we, especially in the last 2 years, globally, we start to see more and more questions about this. Yeah.
Great.
Stop my share.
Okay, thank you so much, Jadé. That was really helpful and powerful, and really was a nice sort of bookend to the two presentations of Myriam and Ebrahim. So I want to go to questions in a conversational format with the three of you before we go to a couple of the questions from the audience that have been piling up. There's so much richness in what was presented, and I was trying to think of how to connect some of the really key points that were made. I want to start with you, Myriam. I mean, one of the things in your presentation that you talked about was the need for new narrative, and also the issue of rebalancing symbols, the need of a new narrative, and what's been done to both create new monuments, both in France and overseas, and the question of what should be removed, and then this broader issue of reparation. Ebrahim, you talked about juxtaposition, which is another way of saying rebalancing to some extent. And then also very powerfully and richly described that you can't just look at these issues of monuments and symbols and place names in a vacuum as specific tangible objects, buildings, or memorials. They actually represent a narrative of a nation, and maybe not a nation fully represented in really in an inclusive representation. And as one of my colleagues said, one of the most difficult things with writing history in stone is it's much easier or much more difficult to banish in the back of a library. And so it's really, you can't separate, and I think what Jadé was talking about as well, is that these are universal challenges. This is not unique to France, to South Africa, to the United Kingdom, or to the United States. It's part of the human experience. And so being able to learn from the three of you is going to be really important, not only for us here in the United States, but there are many people and many questions coming from other parts of the world, in Asia and elsewhere, where people are really trying to navigate these challenges. So maybe the first question I will ask to you, Myriam, and actually hearing from what Ebrahim had to say about this issue of identity in the context of South Africa. What would you take away from what Ebrahim had to say for the work you're doing, particularly in Europe right now, on this issue of here are the options, but maybe the way to go is juxtaposition, is what I thought I heard. And it seems that really resonates with your point about rebalancing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I was listening very carefully was Ebrahim talk, and we were very proud, I will say, with to listen to the reconciliation, how do you say, vérité et réconciliation.
Truth and reconciliation, yeah.
Yes, truth and reconciliation, yes. Because I think it was really a new way to talk about the wrong of the past, and it was a way to construct a new narrative, which is a key question, really. So it was in South Africa. It was a way to bring and to construct a new history, but it is not the same. Well, the question is the same in Europe and in France, but on another way. But it is very important, and I think he has to this question of writing a new history has to do with the way to see the world. You know, the way to see the world, to see the conflict between the East and the West, to see the communist countries and the West countries, with the fall of the wall, of Berlin Wall. It really changed the way to see the balance of power. So that's one thing important. The other thing important is, I think, the Second World War. When the testimony of the survivors was so important. And in the crossing of the new way to see the world and the new way to bring the people into the history, the possibility that citizens who are not part of the top history, I will say. I'm sorry because some words, I miss some words in English. But the people who were the poor people, who were the people who were the subaltern people, they came into the narrative. And I think this trend became more and more important. And the importance of the subaltern persons, the question of dominations, came so important that it leads to this necessity to have a new narrative, and it's a reason for me. It's a universal challenges. Is not linked to a country. Is not linked to a part of the world. I think it's a global movement. I will say.
So thank you, Myriam. Ebrahim, I want to go back to you. And you made several very thought-provoking comments. But one that you said that also ties to what Jadé and Myriam also said, beyond juxtaposition, is the space we occupy as citizens. And I don't mean to space as a citizen or as an immigrant or whatever the legal status may be. I mean the space we have as human beings and individuals walking in a public space. Do we see ourselves in that space? And how do we see ourselves? Do we see ourselves as represented as we see ourselves as individuals in a community and the narratives that we have in our homes and our places of either worship or gathering? Or is it a narrative that others see of us that doesn't really reflect who we are? And, architects talk about understanding a cognitive ecosystem, that how do you move people in a certain way in a building or in an office building or in a broader development? Because what you put up shapes not only where people move and how they navigate, but at a deeply unconscious level, where they see themselves and do they see themselves fully in those spaces. So this isn't just, it strikes me, about narrative from a political, ethnic, legal status, but as fully, present human beings in a particular spot and place. And, there was a big and remains a big issue about mascots using Native American names in this country, whether it be football teams or local high school teams. And a few years ago, the Washington Post did a poll, and they said that when they polled Native Americans about the name, the Washington Redskins, they found that the majority did not find it offensive, which was quite surprising. And there are a lot of reasons why people may say it at the time. But what the research shows is that something doesn't have to be offensive to be harmful, and reinforcing stereotypes. And so these are about claims on space, claims on identity, and claims on memory from people who may not have any clue what those narratives mean for different communities and families. And so this is as much about a recasting of a narrative landscape, a physical public space landscape, and also how do you capture this moment that the world is in, that is increasingly global, with mass movement over many decades now, where these claims and these narratives have to be, out of necessity, reckoned with and reimagined. And going back to your point, not even God can change the past, but what we can do is rescript and narrate the present. And I just want to ask you how you just might think in those terms or respond. And I'm saying this based on your comments. think you're on mute. There you go.
No, thanks very much, Tim. Look, I think that you've said a number of things, but I'm going to pick up on one that I think begins to say why I opt for the juxtaposition in a public space. I think it is the lazy activists' desire to obliterate. It is the power relations that perpetuates. Nothing will change in the public space. This is who we were. I think it is the thoughtful person's approach to do juxtaposition. And so I would say, when you enter a public space, you must find a reflection of yourself. But I am punting far more for not simply something reflective of who you are, but something reflexive. And what I mean, the past must even challenge you. It's not a simple validation that your blackness is enough. Because you've been a victim, your religion is enough. Because some nasty group of people try to obliterate you through genocide, that you suddenly have a perpetual moral mantle that protects you from scrutiny. And therefore, there are those who opt for the reflective. They want to see themselves and they want to be affirmed, even if it means getting rid of the source of the trauma in the public space. But I think what we're asking for is something reflexive. What makes me think? And that is why I'm saying that juxtaposition must be a lesson to both sides of the divide. On the one side, the monument of the past, the supremacy, must be there as a warning of how bad human beings can be to each other and to the world. So we need it there. On the other hand, we must juxtapose it with a representation of the horror that it brought in relation to the victims thereof and give them agency, but in a way that never allows the victims to repeat the mistakes, because it challenges the best that they want to be as human beings. And that's the difference between memorials being reflective and memorials being reflexive. And I'm opting for juxtaposition as the way for reflexivity.
Thank you. And I want to go to, thank you very much, both of you. Jadé, you were talking about that context is really important. And that one of the things in this initiative that you and your colleagues have been doing is not only providing resources and case studies, but each one of those is context specific. And I have a question about, can you point to one example or two examples where a community or a nation has probably navigated this well and maybe chose juxtaposition as a path forward? And the other thing I want to mention around context, I think relates to this, is I mentioned we've been doing a lot of work with brain and behavioral scientists. And one of the most important things I learned from science is that empathy, for example, is contingent on context. In fact, our ability as humans to navigate the world is driven in a lot by context, that we can contextualize the social environment around us or the experiences around us. And there was a statue here of Abraham Lincoln in Boston, similar to the one in Washington, that was put up after the Civil War, of Lincoln freeing slaves, and the slaves were looking up unshackled and thankful to Abraham Lincoln. And for many, many years, people walked by it and didn't think twice about it, until the last year and a half, 2 years. It really took on a salience and an importance where people saw it as really dehumanizing, at a minimum paternalistic. And there were a number of people in this city, and I'm born here, and it's a very, last couple of centuries at least, a very ethnic immigrant city, is people wondered, did Abraham Lincoln all of a sudden, why is he being canceled, right? Why is he being attacked? Why is this statue being taken down? This is to recognize the end of slavery. And rather than trying to address how it's seen in paternalistic or dehumanizing ways. I took advantage of what I've learned from science about context. And I asked these friends of mine who are Irish American, how would they feel if there was a statue of Oliver Cromwell or Queen Victoria, liberating the Irish peasants? And before I could finish, their response is, take it down. Because once they could contextualize a narrative and an identity of loss and suffering to their family and their community, they quickly empathized and understood how this could be seen by another community. And so one of the things I think would be really important is context is absolutely true in terms of each location, but also the context as a process in which our brains can navigate the world around us that we don't know, that are not part of our lived experience as individuals and families and communities. And so as we think about these issues as being also very nuanced, I think there are so many elements of this that we need to bring to bear. And that's why I think the initiative that you and your colleagues have been doing in Europe, and which Myriam is a key part of course, could be helpful. But Jadé, I want to turn to you as we come to an end, and I want to go to one question from the audience. And sorry, audience, that some of these have been addressed. But is there quickly a specific example that you might want to illustrate?
Yes, well, I'll try to keep this brief so the audience have a chance to get their questions answered. I think perhaps the best example that I can think of that sort of encapsulates this idea of the debate we've been having is actually in Bolzano in Italy. It was a Mussolini bas-relief. I'm not sure, I will share a picture afterwards. And what happened was they had this big fascist relief to Mussolini at the former headquarters of the fascist party. And for almost 50 years, there was a very big debate over what to do with it. Should we remove it completely? Should we keep it? And there was also sort of became a focal point for rallying about pro-fascist rallies. So what happens is that this was a multi-ethnic area in Italy. And in 2017, the municipality started a project where they made an open call to artists to submit the applications to the town council, and they held a public vote in order to decide what to do with this monument. So in the end, they decided to keep the monument intact, but they added a neon LED sign across it that said nobody had the right to obey, which is a quote from Hannah Arendt. And of course, this also plays on Mussolini's motto of fight, obey, which was actually on it. So this had a very clear democratic process. It was transparent, and it also recontextualized. And this quote was in all 3 languages, because this has also been a source of tension in Bolzano between German speakers and Italian speakers. So I think this is a very good example, but I think in general, the most important thing is to have a process and to have principles of historical justice, transparency, democratic values guide this, because if the decision is not made with representatives of everyone, then you're just reshaping power in a different form. And I will leave it my comments with that.
Thank you, Jadé. Well, I guess we're at the bewitching hour, as they say, and I want to be fair to the speakers and all the attendees. This has been recorded. I'm sorry we couldn't get all the questions in. One quick thing maybe I would ask Ebrahim to end with is the question, which is that when we think of juxtaposition in the case of dealing with monuments, that can be really offensive to many and certainly harmful. Does that conflict, if I understand the question, with the more inclusive process of dealing with the past? In other words, how to maintain and juxtapose Confederate statues and monuments, does that undermine a process of truth and reconciliation and accountability?
I don't think it should. And that is why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was particularly focused on an exchange, not a free ride for reconciliation. But you have to at least admit to the truth. And I think that we got a far way in it, except with some of the commanding heights. And that is why there was so much ambiguity around the death of someone like F.W. de Klerk. because he was not seen as embracing the idea of truth. A belated recording he made did not wash with the public as he was on his deathbed, simply because he had not embraced the bargain of truth for reconciliation. And so I don't think it's a blank check. I think that there are sources of memory that re-traumatize every time you see it. And so I think that there is room for Jadé's other extreme of removal or relocation. I think that there is a place for it, but I don't think it should be the first resort. It should be a last resort after one have tried. And juxtaposition is not just putting another memorial. I think Jadé's research shows that there are creative ways. There's the placarding in which you explain. There's the way in which you bring the victims into the picture, not in disempowered or patronized ways, but in ways which show the resistance and the superior humanity. I think that this notion of juxtaposition is absolutely crucial because it challenges both ways. It's a double-edged sword rather than a single-edged sword that you wield with righteousness. It shows your own capacity to be dehumanized, and it shows your own challenge to rehumanize yourself, because you could not have come out of apartheid unscathed with your whole humanity intact. Victims have to be healed and rebuilt and systematically. And this process must recognize Mandela's central notion that the struggle against apartheid was also a struggle to humanize the victims and the perpetrators. And I think that's what this debate about memory is all about. And we've got to find the formulation. Sometimes you can't do perpetuation, but the easy reach is not obliteration. Somewhere in between, there is something that humanizes both sides of the conflict.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank everybody as a speaker and also those who are attending. We will make this recording available. And as I think this conversation shows, this is a really critical, important set of issues and questions. There are no clear binary black and white answers. And it's not just about a monument, memorial, or a place name. It's really about the narrative and identity of a nation and a people. And we have so much to learn from abroad. And I think also to learn from people here in the United States who have been dealing with this issue locally for a number of years. And so we look forward to following up. We are building an initiative with our colleagues in Europe and here in the United States around these contested histories, and more info will follow. And I want to thank again Aminata and the Lannan Center for partnering with us in the symposium. There's a program coming up in March that you should look at, and then also Mark Muller at Beyond Borders. And thank you again. Have a good afternoon, or Ebrahim, a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.